Welcome to Turning Hard Times to Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm talking to you from the borough of Queens in New York City. It is the 27th day of December, 2022, and as such, this will be the last show of this year. And also, as I've been saying, I will soon be changing the way we do this show, and to keep up with any changes to this show, I would encourage you to go to my website, jtaylormedia.com. Also follow me on Twitter at jtaylormedia. We want to thank our sponsors for making this show economically viable. Sponsors for this week's show are Irving Resources, Noble Resources, Gold Bull Resources, El Oro Resources, and Timberline Resources. I've titled today's show, Why Central Banks Will Choose Recession Over Inflation. This week, Daniel LeCalle, a professor of economics and a fund manager, will be talking to me for the first time. He'll be with me in the second half of today's show to explain why he thinks central banks will act differently this time by not kicking the can down the road, but by biting the bullet and accepting a recession rather than allowing capital and the dollar to be destroyed. And given Daniel's work as a fund manager, we may also ask him for some ideas about how we might protect ourselves from potential harm of a possible 2023 global recession. As I said, Daniel will be with me during the second half of today's show. The world we are living in now is much, much different than that of March 24, 2009. That was the first episode of Turning Hard Times to Good Times. It was aired on the Voice America Business Channel. My very first guest on that show was G. Edward Griffin, author of a very famous book titled The Creature from Jekyll Island. The Creature from Jekyll Island is also known as the Federal Reserve Bank. Not only did Ed Griffin outline the reasons why, based on Federal Reserve policies, he anticipated a decline in the standard of living for Americans, but also why he voiced his ultimate concern that unless we return to an honest monetary system, we Americans are destined to lose our personal freedoms and property rights to an emerging dictatorship. Again, those were predictions that Ed Griffin had back on March 24, 2009. Fast forward to the end of 2022, and unfortunately, we are very rapidly moving toward an impoverishment of the middle class, and as evidenced by the dictatorial and highly unscientific policies of our federal government during COVID-19, we are also losing our liberties, starting with our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, which the current federal government has chosen to suppress by pressuring Twitter and presumably other social media giants to allowing only speech that is pleasing to the deep state to be made public on those platforms. So unfortunately, events seem to be unfolding very much as Ed Griffin predicted on my show back on March 24, 2009. Right now, I'm going to play a portion of my March 24, 2009 discussion with Ed Griffin, in which he explains why the Fed was created, who was responsible for its creation, and why it has been an unmitigated disaster for the American people. At the same time, it has been used very successfully to fund the military-industrial complex and put trillions of dollars into the hands of America's ruling elite, who live and control our lives from their homes in the unelected deep state. Listen closely now to what G. Edward Griffin had to say nearly 15 years ago about why the Federal Reserve was created, by whom, and why it has such disdain for gold as money.
The first chapter of your book is entitled The Journey to Jekyll Island. The book starts out by talking about this clandestine gathering of a group of men who boarded a luxury train, I believe in Hoboken, New Jersey, to go to this place called Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. And they were pretending to go duck hunting, if I'm not mistaken. Could you tell our listeners who these men were and why were they pretending to go duck hunting, and what was the real purpose of their meeting?
Yeah, you're quite right. It's hard to cover so much ground in so little time. The book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, ostensibly is about the Federal Reserve System, but it's much bigger than that. It's about the nature of money. It's about economic laws. It's about the abuse of the power to create a nation's money and how that abuse leads to corruption in government and so many things that are now descending around our heads. But it ostensibly is about the Federal Reserve System, which is the mechanism by which the United States creates money on behalf of the government. And the meeting to which you were referring back in 1910 at Jekyll Island was the seminal meeting where a small group of the wealthiest people in the world, or representing their firms, 7 of them, went to Jekyll Island because it was out of the beaten path. It was very private. And in fact, they even denied for quite some time that they went to such a meeting. It was a secret meeting. And it was at that meeting that they hammered together all the important details of what was to become the Federal Reserve System 3 years later when it was passed into law in 1913. Now, the reason they did this in secret and denied that they were participating is a very simple reason. The Federal Reserve was offered to the American people as an agency of the federal government. Supposedly they thought it was an agency of the federal government, and it wasn't. But it was offered to them as an agency which was supposed to put the reins on the very powerful banking dynasties in Wall Street. The people of America were very concerned by this huge power, economic power that had coalesced into the hands of a few Wall Street investment firms. They knew that the credit of the entire nation was wrapped up in a few banks and insurance companies. They were concerned about that, and they thought that the Federal Reserve System was going to put controls on those very wealthy, powerful institutions, and make sure that they served the purposes of the nation rather than the private purposes of the corporations. And so the reason for the secrecy is that the very corporations and institutions which supposedly were to be controlled by this legislation were the ones that were drafting the legislation. They decided that, well, okay, the people want some laws now to control our industry, so we're not going to wait for enemies of our industry to write those laws. We will do it ourselves, and we'll hide that fact. We'll let the people think that it was done by their noble politicians when, in fact, we are the ones that are drafting it, and that's the reason for the secrecy. It's a very simple and an obvious logical arrangement when you think about it. And the people that went there, the 7 of them, were Nelson Aldrich, who was the Republican whip in the Senate, one of the wealthiest men in the country, Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury at that time, but he came from a banking family, and that's the reason he was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, because basically he had banking connections. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was president of the National City Bank of New York. Henry P. Davison was a senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles D. Norton was president of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong was there. He was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And finally, Paul Warburg was there, who was a full partner in Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And, of course, his brother, Max Warburg, was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Those are the guys that drafted the Federal Reserve Act. And when you look at the wealth which they held individually and which their banks and institutions held, according to estimates at the time, which we pulled out of the New York Times, was that they represented about 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. Now, that was, in other words, the very banking cartel, the industry, the money trust, as they called it in the newspapers those days. Mm-hmm. That was the very money trust that supposedly the Federal Reserve System was supposed to control. Mm-hmm. And they drafted the legislation. Well, now we jump ahead to today. What's the fruit of that? The reason these guys created the Federal Reserve System is so that they could use the governmental power that backed it to make sure that they would enjoy a nice, handsome profit no matter whether their businesses failed or succeeded. Because they knew that if their businesses were probably going to fail because they were undergoing very unsound banking practices. They were lending money they didn't have. They didn't really concern themselves too much with the ability of the person to pay, or the institution or country to pay back the loans, because they knew that in the event of a crisis, they could always go to the taxpayer and get the taxpayers to put up the money to cover the losses. That was all started back in 1910. And, for years, people tried to tell the American people that this is what's going on and you better look out because, you're going to wind up picking up this huge bill. And nobody was interested. They said, I don't believe that. Anyway, we're living well, aren't we? Look at the prosperity. Well, now, here we are now in 2009. And it's finally coming down the way some of us have been predicting all these years. And now people are saying, well, what happened? Well, how did this happen? How did we let this happen? Well, they let it happen is because they didn't care.
Yeah.
They didn't take an interest. Now it's very, very, very late.
But Ed, the reasons given to us, constantly by the media has always been, it's for our own good. They're going to, they're going to manage the economy. They're going to be able to avoid significant downturns in the economy by having more liquidity, by having the Federal Reserve being able to create lots of money. But that obviously isn't working out too well, is it?
Well, no, that's always been the argument from the very beginning, back in 1913 when they passed the bill. It was all to help America. It was all to help you folks, the average person. We are doing this, the bankers are saying. We bankers are doing this, and we politicians are doing this for you folks. Not all. We don't benefit, do we? Of course not. It's a bunch of nonsense. It's propaganda, and it's just amazing to me that the average voter is so politically illiterate that they fall for that stuff over and over and over again. They actually believe that the government is there to help them. They actually believe that.
Well, Ed, you could say in a way then that the stated reasons for the Federal Reserve's creation has been a failure, perhaps, but has the Fed, looking at it from through their own eyes, if you could do so, has the Fed's real reasons for being created been a failure, do you think?
Oh, it's been a rip-roaring success.
Uh-huh.
The Federal Reserve has succeeded on every one of the principles which they set out to do back on Jekyll Island when they discussed the purpose of the Fed.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it was to control the competition. They were concerned over the arrival of new banks springing up in the South and on the West Coast of the expanding nation in those days, and they wanted to keep control in New York with the existing biggest banks. They wanted to be able to pass on their losses to the taxpayer. They wanted to be able to create money out of nothing so as to manipulate interest rates, which would drive people to the banks to borrow money at low interest rates rather than for people to save money and do whatever they wanted to do, expand business or take vacations or whatever they wanted to do with money. Instead of saving the money, they wanted to bring the people into the banks to borrow money because the banks make money only when others come in and borrow. Mm-hmm. The banks really don't want you to pay back your loans. They want you to just keep those loans open forever, like a credit card statement, and just send in your interest every month.
Well, Ed, as I understand, as the United States was a young country in the early 1900s, it was growing very rapidly. The late 1800s, it was growing very rapidly, and there were a lot of very successful companies that were not really needing banks. They were actually growing from internally generated funds. That is, they took their profits and reinvested them so that the institutions, the industrial companies themselves were actually, in a sense, banking interest, and they were crowding out the big New York, the money center banks. Was that then part of their reason was to avoid that competition? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying, yes. They did not want private capital formation. That was almost like a dirty phrase. They spoke, how can we circumvent private capital formation as though it was an evil thing. They wanted people coming to the banks to borrow money rather than save it.
Well, we've heard this phrase recently in the mainstream media, privatizing profits, socializing losses, and I guess that's what they've been doing. But Ed, when we're talking about now, we're talking about not billions of dollars, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars of socialized losses that the common folks are being asked to shoulder. Is that what's going on here? And did that all have its origins back in 1910 then?
That's right. It's been going on for a long time, but it's certainly accelerating right now to the point where I think the cup is going to be full. I mean, there comes a point when you do have total socialized government, socialized industry, socialized everything, banking, healthcare, and so forth. You start off with 10% and then 15, 20, 30, 80, and so forth. At some point, you get to 100%. And I think we're very close to that, and these guys in Washington are laying out the roadmap to get us to that point in a very short period of time now. And when we get to 100%, I think people need to realize that not only is the economy totally regimented by government, but people themselves are totally regimented by government.
And Ed, I think that it's true that socialism doesn't really create wealth. It is a consumer of wealth. The capitalism really creates wealth. We're going to have to take a break here in a little bit, but one of the things I want to ask you about is gold, and what role did gold play? Gold has been the enemy of of sort of the fractional reserve banking system that the Federal Reserve has espoused. So, when we come back, maybe you could address that issue a little bit, or maybe get started on it right now for the next few seconds.
Well, yeah, just to get started on it, gold has always been the enemy of politicians and bankers who want the ability to expand, create money supply out of nothing so they can collect interest on huge amounts of nothing, literally. Gold has always been a discipline which they hate. And so there's a great propaganda war to convince the American people that gold is not a good thing. You should not have a monetary system backed by gold. And I'm not quite sure why, but they've heard it so many times that they just repeat it.
Well, we do have to go to break now, but when we come back, Ed Griffin will pick up on why sound money in the form of gold is essential to the retention of a free and prosperous capitalist society, and why its absence leads to socialism and absolute misery for the masses.